Hi everyone, I can see everyone filtering in as we've now gone live. I'll wait 10 more seconds just to make sure that we've got everyone with their audio connected. Okay, I can see the numbers are still going up, but a little bit more slowly. And given that we want to get plenty of time to answer some of your questions, I think we'll get started now. Hi, everyone. My name's Alex Scott. I'm E3G's Climate Diplomacy and Geopolitics lead. I'm here on the ground in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27. And we've got here today three of our experts from E3G, our co-CEO, Nick Mabey, our Senior Associate and very long-time COP veteran, Alden Meyer, and our finance expert and Associate Director, Kate Levick. Quick note on housekeeping: if you would like to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A function in Zoom from the buttons at the bottom of the Zoom window. Or if you'd like to, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you so that you can speak your question to us. We'll take questions as we're going through so that we can get through as many as possible in the time after we've had some short interventions from our three speakers. But to quickly set up the context for the interventions that our speakers will bring today, quickly on the background to what we're expecting from COP overall. The outcome here will be judged not just on the announcements that countries have made on their emissions reduction ambition or the finance that they're contributing to climate vulnerable countries, but also on the negotiated agenda, the deals that are made on the key negotiating issues of loss and damage finance, adaptation finance, and mitigation ambition. On top of that, there is the discussion of the cover text that parties will agree. The role of that cover text is to refer to some of the decisions that are being taken, the deals that are being made, but also to bring in broader political signals and norms, set some norms about where we need to go from here, particularly capturing some of the political sentiment from the World Leaders Summit. And what we've had this year, interestingly, is the G20 Summit taking place in the middle of the COP, after we'd had a World Leaders segment at the COP. The COP had started with a relatively smooth process on the agenda that wasn't quite expected, so it was smoother than expected, and a lot of high octane energy from the World Leaders segment, talking about wanting to accelerate commitments to reduce emissions, but also talking about wanting to influence reforms in the global finance institutions far beyond the UNFCCC space. But of course, China and India weren't here at the World Leaders Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh. I'm just going to pause for a second and make sure that I am heard. I am, yes, okay. I had a bit of a strange echo. Was just saying, of course, China and India weren't here at Sharm el-Sheikh at the World Leaders segment. So the G20 has been that real litmus test of is that sentiment that we've captured from the World Leaders Summit in Sharm el-Sheikh really representative of global unity. The negotiations here have been very sluggish, so we were relying on the G20 outcome to inject some political momentum into the deals that need to be made here. But I think what we'd like to get from the panel here today is, has that political momentum been injected? We know that adaptation and loss and damage, two of the major crux issues for the COP, weren't crux issue agenda of the G20. So we're not going to have a speaker going through those, but I'm here. I can answer some questions on those as needed, if you've got questions on adaptation and loss and damage in particular. Instead, we're going to go to Nick Mabey, our co-CEO, for a flavor of how the G20 and COP interact. I'll then go to Alden to give us an update specifically on the mitigation ambition agenda and the energy transition agenda and how that's coming from the G20 into the COP. And then to Kate, who will pick up on the finance thread and give us an update on where finance transitions financing transitions and the broader institutional reform stand after the G20 summit. So Nick, over to you, and a reminder to everyone, please add your questions into the Q&A or prepare to raise your hand, and we'll come to questions after the three panelists. Please go ahead, Nick.
Great, thanks a lot, Alex. And I'll just be quite brief. I mean, the big question coming into COP27 was how Ukraine and US-China tensions were going to undermine or influence climate action at COP and at the G20. And what we've seen, to be honest, is more positive than many expected. But what we've seen, which is really a lack of backsliding with some modest progress, is still not enough to meet the climate challenge we face. And so that leaves a lot to do for next year. So that's our kind of general coming out. So, I mean, started off with the kind of positive, I mean, certainly much more positive than most people were expecting, Xi-Biden bilateral, which didn't turn around US-China relations, but it signaled a kind of détente, which allowed certainly a lot of the Chinese participants in COP and to feel there was space for them to talk and engage more, and a feeling that there was some positive business to be done, perhaps not as cooperation, but as an alignment of interests around, and it certainly lifted the spectre of kind of geopolitical tensions spilling over into Sharm el-Sheikh, as they started to do in Glasgow last year. So I think that was kind of certainly lifted some of the risks people wondered. And the G20 actually managed to agree a communique, which many diplomatic observers were not expecting. It mainly kept a previous language on climate change, but that was pretty important. 1.5 degrees was kept in the text. There had been some pushback on that in other areas. Big focus on implementing Paris, phasing down coal. And so even though there were parties pushing against, the general centre ground was pretty much Glasgow and moving forward on Glasgow. And I think a very clear signal that even though we're in an energy crisis, which has caused many in the fossil fuel industry to argue for more fossil fuel exploration, which of course is against the 1.5 target, that clean energy is seen as the way out of the energy crisis. And I think that's where, you know, one of the side deals, the JETP between International Partners Group and Indonesia on funding of $20 billion to fund the decarbonisation of Indonesia's power sector was a good example of a practical but also a political signal that there was going to be more help coming for countries to move off fossil fuels. And obviously that happening to Indonesia, the G20 host, was really important. On the more negative side, the area we really needed G20 to add momentum to COP27 was finance, because obviously that's underlying a lot of the problems here. There was lots of language about addressing debt and fiscal space crisis that's preventing so many countries from actually investing in clean energy, even if they'd like to. We saw some progress and words in that, including on trying to push the World Bank and others to increase the amount of money they'll lend to countries, particularly on climate, but on broader development issues. But most of that will only really come to fruition next year in the spring meetings and the other meetings next year. So it's unlikely to affect the dynamics of COP27. So not as strong a signal as people would have wanted, though many of the issues are being picked up, like the issues of debt in countries hit by climate impacts, to be dealt with later. So in summary, I think the G20 secured a baseline of Glasgow with a little bit of plus, but it didn't give the huge injection of energy we'd hoped to get COP27 over the line, which really leaves the dynamics in COP27, which Alden will talk about, having to deliver for themselves without a big negative overhang, but also without really strong push from leaders to get things done. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. That baseline secured, but Alden, over to you. What does that mean for the cover text of mitigation ambition in particular?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as everyone knows, there's a huge gap in mitigation ambition in 2030 between what's needed to have any chance of holding temperature increases to 1.5 and what's currently reflected in Paris commitments. So, you know, what we got out of Glasgow was a mandate to do several things. It requested parties to revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets in their NDCs. Some countries have done that, about 24 of them, but it only amounts to about 3 or 4% reduction in 2030 emissions compared to the 40% plus that the IPCC says is needed. It mandated annual high-level ministerial roundtables on pre-2030 ambition and synthesis reports from the Secretariat on the collective impact of NDCs and long-term strategies. And it invited the UN Secretary General to convene a World Leaders Summit in 2023 to consider ambition out to 2030. But its centerpiece, of course, was mandating that this COP adopt a decision to launch a pre-2030 mitigation work program. And we think the scope of that program needs to be broad, not just focusing on enhancing NDCs, but accelerating sectoral decarbonization commitments and spurring implementation of economy-wide as well as sectoral plans and policies. All three of these are crucial if we're going to close that ambition gap. The mitigation work program needs to run until 2030. Some parties here have proposed it be a 1 or 2 year minimal process. And we think it needs to engage governors, mayors, business and investors, and other subnational actors who are really the tip of the spear in many countries when it comes to implementation. Now, negotiations on the decision were quite slow last week under the negotiators and the co-facilitators, but they really picked up pace yesterday when parties met for 8 hours in closed rooms to develop some bridging text and narrow their differences. And they continue those meetings at the negotiator level today. But at the same time, Minister Dan Jorgensen of Denmark and Minister Barbara Creasy of South Africa have been mandated by the presidency to conduct political consultations with parties to work out landing zones for the final mitigation work program decision. And they're asking for views on 6 questions they've laid out to ministers to deal with some of the issues their negotiators have been unable to resolve. What's going to happen is the answers to these questions will help ministers identify landing zones for the presidency to include in its proposed work on the mitigation work plan. And I think we can get to a fairly decent mitigation work program by the end of the week here, but only if there's progress on other issues in the negotiations, especially on loss and damage finance. Of course, in addition to the decision on the mitigation work program, we need to see elements on mitigation in the cover text or the cover decision. As Nick said, a lot of that will be facilitated by the agreements that were reached in Bali and the G20, particularly noting that the IPCC is the scientific baseline, that we need a commitment to limit warming to 1.5 C, reiterating the call on countries to submit targets, tougher targets under Paris, ending fossil fuel subsidies, pursuing just energy transition partnerships, and mobilizing public and private sector finance to decarbonize developing country economies. The one thing that was not agreed at the G20, which India is pushing here, is to expand the call to phase down emissions from unabated coal to include oil and gas as well. That was blocked in Bali, but we believe they're going to continue to try to do that here. And we're urging other parties to support that. There's no reason the coal should be singled out. It was a political decision, not a scientific one in Glasgow. And we need to see that mandate expanded to all fossil fuels, of course, with commitments to equity and financial support for developing country transition. Some have feared that the Saudis and Russians and others will block that. I say bring it on. Put this out there in the presidency's text and dare them to try to strip it out and explain why they think coal emissions should be reduced, but not the emissions from the products they produce and export. So I'll leave it there, Alex. Turn it back to you.
Thanks very much, Alden. And I imagine there might be some questions, particularly on that fossil fuel language that you've just mentioned. But Kate, finance is obviously central to all of this. Can we go to you for an update on where we've got to on finance and what might be the prospects for the COP from here?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So discussions of financial system reform, which of course, strictly speaking, those don't belong in the COP context beyond the specific COP finance issues. But of course, COP does end up being a much broader forum for discussion, and those discussions of broader financial system reform have taken place at this COP more than ever before. That's spurred on by the challenging global economic circumstances, and also to some extent with by the overlap with G20 leaders. So it's perhaps no surprise that we've seen that same awareness of a global need for financial system reforms coming through from the G20 leader statement today. So just to mention a few of the key sort of places that bigger ideas have been coming from, of course, there's the Bridgetown initiative, which is headed by Barbados, currently proposing a wise persons group to develop reform options for international financial architecture. And they've got some specific ideas on the table. They include implementing the recommendations of the G20's MDB Capital Adequacy Framework Review, which the G20 also talked about, using 100 billion of special drawing rights to support emergency liquidity, creating a loss and damage fund, which of course is under discussion at COP, and setting up a global climate mitigation trust. And the G20 President Macron has said that he will host a finance summit in Paris in June 2023 to help take this agenda forward. Separately at COP, we saw Vera Songwe and Nick Stern presenting recommendations from a presidency-backed independent high-level expert group on climate finance. They laid out a whole suite of reform options, some of which chimed with the Bridgetown initiative, and they calculated that this would mobilise 2.4 trillion of assets annually by 2030 to invest in climate transition. And also not forgetting that at COP last week, the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero recommended, among other things, a new international task force for regulators on net zero. So it's possible that we could see some of these things coming together, and it's very clear that there's a lot of appetite to have these big discussions, even though they don't quite fit in COP, and even the G20 is only kind of edging itself towards those bigger reform discussions, but it's very much in the air in both places. Turning to fossil fuels. So, you know, the G20 has been helpful on that front. The statement recommits to phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. And of course, when the UN H-leg was launched last week, the UN Secretary General was very clear that, you know, he recommended no new fossil fuel projects, including coal, should be financed by non-state actors. At the same time, we've had this push that Alden just talked about to move high-level language away from the coal phase-down language that was agreed at COP26 to talking about phasing down all fossil fuels. Alden's talked about that already, so I won't repeat, but you know, it's an important move. The Asian Development Bank announced that it would fund the world's first deal for the early retirement of a coal plant under its energy transition mechanism in Indonesia. But meanwhile, it's also worth pointing out that it's not all sunshine. The MDB's joint statement on Paris alignment at COP failed to mention fossil fuels at all. So definitely some politics around that still between the MDBs and potentially with the World Bank in particular. I'd say one of the most debated topics at COP27 is the role of gas in transition pathways for developing countries. And it is notable that there haven't been any what you'd call massive wins on that from the pro-gas lobby. I think it's, you know, a very difficult topic, but I think, you know, just about all actors concerned are still taking that 1.5 boundary as the framing and understanding that there is a recommendation that this requires no new fossil infrastructure. So then looking at JETPs, which is a obvious segue from there. So the JETP story has continued this thread of systemic reforms that go beyond the COP negotiation dynamics alone to bring together public and private financing for climate transition. So before COP, South Africa's $8.5 billion investment plan was made public. At the G20 yesterday, we saw the announcement of an initial 20 billion JETP deal for Indonesia. That's 10 billion of public sector pledges matched by a commitment of 10 billion from 7 private firms who are all members of GFANZ. And it's likely that a Vietnam JETP deal will land before the end of the year and that India and Senegal will follow in 2023. So the JETP concept seems established now, but it will need to deliver on the implementation. And the long-term thinking will need to be how the lessons from individual JETPs can feed into a broader system of public-private finance for energy transition. So back to that bigger architecture question. So all of that context has been playing into the negotiations when it comes to the climate finance topics that are still very much under discussion and all yet to land. Feelings have remained high among developing countries about the delayed achievement of the 100 billion finance goal. But discussions have been active and potentially constructive in relation to the framing of the next goal to come into force after 2025. So we're watching that closely. There have also been attempts to elevate the status of the Paris finance goal, Article 2.1c. So this is the goal that sits alongside the temperature goal and the adaptation goal to align all financial flows with climate action. To what extent to elevate that and create new action areas around it has been a point of contention through the talks. It's not quite clear how that will land, but it is looking very likely that one way or another, some further discussions will be catalysed around that through 2023. So I think that's all from me. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kate. And a lot there on the finance side so far, lots more on finance and mitigation, and also on adaptation and loss and damage to be discussed through the COP to build on the baseline that Nick mentioned this G20 outcome secures for us. So I've got 2 hands raised to come in and ask questions. I don't have anything in the Q&A yet, but please do add any questions into the Q&A or raise your hand if you do want to come in. Could I ask you to remind us which outlet you're writing for, and also let me know if there's a particular speaker that you want to direct your question to. I've got Seth and then Rachel to come in with questions. Seth, can I hand over to you first, please? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you for doing this. Just looking at loss and damage, can you go through where you see the red lines are right now? And is there any place where it can be threaded between there? Or are these intersecting lines that there's just nowhere through? Thanks.
Yes, definitely. And I can take that question. I might ask Rachel if we could get you to come in and give us your question at the same time, and then I'll come back on Seth's question and see if perhaps Alden wants to add anything. Rachel, please go ahead.
Sure. And sorry if it's a little bit loud here. So this one is kind of an extension to Seth's question on loss and damage, but I'm really interested in Mia Motley's Bridgetown agenda, and if folks can talk more about that, how much traction is gaining, this idea of, changing the entire multinational development bank system, and how that kind of how would that be a way into a loss and damage finance facility, and just, giving us more details on sort of that linkage. Yeah, thank you.
Great. I will start with that, and then Kate, I might bring you in on the Bridgetown agenda in particular. So I think on loss and damage, obviously the starting points were poles apart, with the G77 and China very clear that what they want out of this COP is a decision to create a new fund under the auspices of the UNFCCC operating entities. And that was going to be the clear, if not red, then very pink line for them. And on the other side, some uncertainty from the European side, I think, around the timeline for creating a fund, or where something is created this year versus spending time properly understanding where the gaps are in funding that already exists, and taking a decision in 2 years' time about what the fund looks like, to the US position, which was starting from a very clear position of not wanting to establish a fund before working out how that fund would be established and what it would be serving. So not quite in line with the G7 and China position. I think we saw over the first week very, very slow progress, not much progress at the technical level about what the landing grounds could look like. I think that's only just starting to emerge now. I think we know, and Alden mentioned, we're aware that the ministerial pair appointed to shepherd a landing ground on this issue have a set of questions that are being taken to ministers, I think, as we speak or in the next hour, to try and flesh out what the landing ground looks like. I would say that there's a little more confidence in finding a landing ground that looks like a clear timeline to setting up a new funding arrangement, with some more confidence that a new funding arrangement would be the thing that comes out of the process of negotiations. But there's still a very long way to go to be able to formalize a landing ground around that. And I think Alden also mentioned that we're seeing this lack of a landing ground on loss and damage preventing a really clear, high ambition package, a coalition forming around a high ambition package that encompasses the loss and damage, adaptation, finance, and mitigation elements of the COP outcome. So I think a few late nights to come to really get to the bottom of that landing ground. Kate, can we go to you on the Bridgetown agenda in particular, and where that might bring in the broader finance system reforms into this COP process, but also that loss and damage question?
Okay, sure. So, I mean, the Bridgetown agenda, or the Bridgetown initiative, I think going into the COP, there was a real uncertainty as to what extent that would sort of land and be taken up. I think we've seen it get a pretty warm reaction from a lot of different stakeholders. And so far, the diplomatic footwork has been very deft. Of course, that's a agenda of reforms that needs to be taken up potentially in a number of different places, and COP is just one opportunity to get buy-in and land some of those ideas. The proposal that Mabey's made is to create a wise persons group going forward to take forward some of the reforms, and I think one of the challenges for that is that there are very clear reforms that could be made in the short term and some concrete ideas for those, but actually for this agenda to work, to make the financial system transformation that we need, you also need kind of medium and longer term reforms, and it can be very difficult politically to get the same level of buy-in and traction for those from political actors, and yet that is what's needed. So I think this is going to be an ongoing campaign, but so far, yes, it has been getting a great deal of support, and I think widening the window of what kind of reforms can be talked about, which is very helpful, because the G7 and the G20 were getting themselves stuck potentially in quite a narrow place in the last year or so. The question was specifically about MDB reform, so I'll just say something about that a little bit. There's a huge amount of pressure on the multilateral development banks right now to reform more, to step up, partly because although lots of very interesting things are happening in individual banks, their collective action and collective statements have been very weak again in the last couple of years, and we saw that again with an unthrilling sort of joint Paris alignment output in the first week of COP. A lot of pressure in particular on the World Bank to really step up and show a change of leadership, and we have started to see statements from Malpass that really show that he is sort of getting that pressure and potentially trying to step up to the expectations. There are lots of specific reforms that can be taken forward. The one that's running on everyone's lips is the capital adequacy framework review and implementing those recommendations. Bridgetown initiative is asking for that. The G20 has referenced that, and we'd certainly like to see that. The Stern-Songway report also speaks about actually putting more capital into the MDBs, not just using their capital in more effective ways, but also just having more firepower. That's a discussion that has yet to be fully mainstream. But fundamentally, these are really important institutions that can play a unique role in the system. They could have a role in loss and damage. They don't have to. There's more than one way to channel finance for loss and damage, but they have a number of important roles that they could be playing in the financial transition to net zero that really they're not fully playing yet, and I think all eyes are on them to make that change.
Thanks very much.
I just want to add just a couple of glosses out, and I think what Bridgetown has done is some ways kind of put a political frame around some things that are happening already. Perhaps people didn't realise. So this new Resilience Sustainability Trust Fund at the IMF, which has now got, I think it's around 80 billion in pledges of social drawing rights now, and that is definitely part of the loss and damage resilience financing framework, and additional calls on clauses to use special drawing rights to support multilateral development banks. That was in the G20 statement, and the new idea of climate impact clauses in debt agreements. So many of the things in Bridgetown are actually already seeping into discussions, not in a consistent way, and they need to go all the way to implementation. But I think it's been there's been a kind of bottom-up and top-down approach, and I think this Macron summit for next year, which Kate mentioned, is really interesting to see how next year turns into a really big year for trying to move these from kind of individual initiatives, which are a bit scattered, to something that looks a bit more like a political movement that gets really solid leader level support, and therefore, as Kate says, can go from good short-term things to really powerful medium-term things, which is what we need to shape the mitigation debate and some of the politics around loss and damage. It needs to be visible, not just practical.
Yeah, definitely. I'd like to bring Alden in quickly, going back to the question on loss and damage, a bit more about the US position, if you could share, and also picking up the question in the Q&A from Andrew Friedman about the fossil fuel language from India that you mentioned earlier, where you saw that as a tactical move, what you think the potential is for it to be adopted in this COP space, given that there's likely opposition from Saudi Arabia and others.
Okay, first on loss and damage, people need to understand this is a long-running dispute, particularly between the US and AOSIS, the small island states. It goes back to the beginning of this process in 1991 and has run through. And I recall in Doha in 2012, conducting shuttle diplomacy with a number of other NGOs between the US and AOSIS to prevent the US from crashing the entire COP over AOSIS's demand on loss and damage. 1 year later, we got the Warsaw Mechanism on loss and damage. And one of the tasks there was to identify innovative sources of finance to scale up and support activities to deal with loss and damage. And of course, that hasn't happened. And that's why there's so much frustration and anger boiling over from the small island states, the other vulnerable countries, and every developing country. I mean, look at Pakistan. They've suffered over $30 billion in damage from the recent flooding. And so far, all that's on offer from the US and Europe and others to help them is about 200 million, less than 1%. They're expected to cover the rest of that themselves when they're already suffering huge debt, food insecurity, energy insecurity, et cetera. We need a solution. The good news is the US and Europe and others have moved and acknowledged that we need a solution, we need a political agenda item. They're fighting over this facility. We can work out the agreement on the facility itself. There's obvious ways to compromise there with a presumption that a facility will be established once we identify how it fits into the broader mosaic of institutions and governance, et cetera. The bigger question is not the fund, it's the funds with an S. Where is the money going to come from? We're already tapping out developed country bilateral budgets for mitigation and adaptation, and certainly the US can't get its Congress to go along with what's needed there, and developing countries are rightly concerned that we not rob Peter to pay Paul and Mary by raiding adaptation and mitigation funding. So we need innovative sources, fossil fuel taxes, airline levies, financial transaction taxes, the kind of things that Kate was talking about in Bridgetown, tapping special drawing rights. We need big money because it is hundreds of billions, and that is where they need to turn to, not fighting over the institutional mechanism and you create a new fund or use existing funds. My view is we need both. We need a fund dedicated solely to loss and damage, and we need to use the Green Climate Fund, the World Bank, and other existing mechanisms as well, because we're going to need to mobilize lots of money for lots of different purposes on this. It can be resolved. We're in good hands with Jennifer and Misa. They're two amazing women, two incredible ministers. They have the skills to do this, but it is going to require that the US shift. It's also going to require that some of the big developing countries shift from the very hardline position they just took in the G77 paper, which really tries to reintroduce the firewall between developed and developing countries. It says that all developing countries are entitled to loss and damage support, and no developing countries have to provide any finance for loss and damage support. And that's a position we know the US and others can't accept. It's almost like it was designed to inflame passions rather than cool them and reach an agreement. But I think we can do that. On Andrew's question, India raised this in the closed door negotiations in Glasgow, wanting to expand coal to oil and gas, and they're right from a science perspective. We have to phase down all three. They're also right from an equity perspective. Coal is increasingly the fuel that's relied on more and more by developing countries as developed countries have phased it out, whereas developed countries are reliant more on oil and gas. And so singling out coal seems like it's discriminating against developing countries. The problem, of course, is because of the Saudis, we have a consensus rulemaking process in the COPs, and we need broad agreement. And we know that Russia, Saudi Arabia, other countries would oppose expanding to oil and gas. My view is let's build support for that among developed and developing countries to include oil and gas, get the president to put it in the decision, and then dare the Saudis and the Russians to come out and explain why they think coal should be phased down, but not oil and gas, in view of the whole world in the closing plenary of the COP. So, and I think there was some fear from the US and others before the G20 decision that maybe this was a tactical play by India, that they would put forward oil and gas knowing it would be blocked, and then they would say, well, if we can't expand it to all fossil fuels, let's take out the coal language from Glasgow. My fear on that is much less in light of the G20 decision that reiterated the coal phase down language, because I don't think the Indian minister is going to go against what Prime Minister Modi agreed to in Bali.
Thanks very much, Alden. Kate, can I come to you to answer some of the questions in the Q&A? From Sarah first on the issue of 2.1c. What's the debate here? Who's trying to minimize the language about this and who's pushing for it to be elevated? And also from Anjali on the JETPs. Is there any indication so far about what has been learned? Do we need to keep reinventing the wheel every time, or is there something that can cut that circuit? Thanks, Kate.
Sure. So on the 2.1c side, then, I mean, there's quite a substantial number of countries who, would be supportive of elevating this agenda. But unfortunately, this is very much mixed up with the politics of other finance aspects of COP. So the countries that introduced or attempted to introduce it to the agenda this time were those in Europe and then some other developed economies. When it was introduced, however, it got very, very quickly mixed up with discussions around climate finance. And of course, if you put yourself in the perspective of one of the developing countries where sorting out climate finance issues is your top priority, this could look like a bit of a diversion, something that could almost be created as a conditionality that you won't get climate finance unless you do some of these other things. And it's it's unfortunate that at the moment, rather than creating that bigger perspective on changing the overall financial landscape, which of course includes climate finance flows, that it has sometimes been treated as a trade-off. And I think that's the place that we've been stuck. I think certainly this COP is the one where that discussion's been more open and more constructive than we've seen for quite a long time in terms of being able to create that bigger framing. But there is a lot of sort of historic I guess, suspicion around what it is that countries do when they try and bring 2.1c onto the agenda. Is it, something that's a kind of potentially a bit of a private sector agenda that favours private sector interest? Is it something that will create burden for the developing countries? And is it something that could hold up agreement on substantial climate finance flows? So it's very much around trust and creating the common vision for what's actually needed in terms of systemic financial reform. And then on the JETPs, it's a really, really good question. And of course, this has been the key question around the JETPs. If you create a very complicated bespoke deal for every country, how can that possibly be scaled up? I think clearly we do have proof of concept that it's possible to create those agreements, and that's very important in itself to bring together the different sources of public and private finance and different types of institution. Every country's circumstances are very different, and we're going to see that continue for the first few JETPs. But over time, it is important that we try and move towards some kind of sort of architectural sort of framework in which they can sit, where countries and their arrangements will start to become similar. There will start to be JETPs that are a bit like a JETP that was done before. And the more we get to that situation, the more I think it will be possible to create sort of institutional frameworks and accelerate, because obviously there are many, many countries who are potentially in the queue to talk about financing their transition.
Yeah, I mean, just to add on the JETPs, as Kate said, they're all a bit bespoke suits at the moment, but yeah, we can't decarbonize the world with Savile Row, I'm afraid. And I think we are seeing some, definitely some learning on how to structure the policies and the just transition elements, which was some of the most innovative part of the South African deal and spent years working out. But we lack, we're still cobbling together the money and don't have platforms for money. So I think that's where one of the big processes going. Link back to leaders is one of the interesting parts of the Indonesian JETPs, because we need that political oversight to keep the pressure on. But to be honest, it's the same bunch of developed countries, which is essentially UK, US, France, Germany, the Commission, as the kind of main drivers of these, the G7. They need to link back to some of these big infrastructure partnerships that were launched last year as well at the G7. So we have lots of pieces of machinery like the Global Gateway and the G7 partnership lying around. They haven't really been connected to this, and we'll be looking for kind of allocation of significant resources in all those countries to support and drive forward the JETPs alongside the national platforms built by the countries themselves, if we're going to get the scale up we need beyond these first few test runs.
Thanks, Nick. And going to some of the other questions in the chat now, from Tor and Rebecca and Alyssa. Alden, could I turn to you to talk us through a bit of the end game, how you're seeing the end game likely to play out, where the 1.5 conversation might come in, and any risks of walkout, any threats of walkout based on frustration with the pace of some of the negotiations, particularly on loss and damage? And if you have it, any prediction of the timing of that final end game?
Sure. Well, as I said, I think the 1.5C has been relatively diffused by the G20 agreement. I don't expect a huge fight on that here. We'll see if India really pushes forward on the oil and gas. That could be a fight with the Saudis and Russians and others at the end of the day. But as I said, I think the real crunch issues are going to come down to the loss and damage bridging zone, and maybe some of the other finance issues. Finance has always been a crunch issue in this process since the beginning, and it is here again. I think this can all be resolved. There are good pairs of ministers working on these issues. I would just say the Egyptians waited a bit late to get them going. In Glasgow, for example, the UK had pairs of ministers working weeks in advance of even coming to Glasgow to try to consult with ministers, identify landing zones. The Egyptians, with the exception of Misa and Jennifer, who they asked to take on loss and damage earlier, appointed the other four ministers, pairs of ministers last night. It's very late in the game. We're running out of time. It can be done, but it's a high wire act. In terms of predictions, based on the late start, I would say we're going into Saturday, probably Saturday night. I hope not echoing Durban on Sunday morning, or even going into late Sunday, early Monday, as we did in Madrid because of Article 6. I think we can get out of here on Saturday, but it's going to require progress, particularly on loss and damage in the next day or two. The other thing is just what's the process of the president. The ministers are going to be reporting to him this evening about their initial consultations. He gave the SP chairs and the negotiators until today as well to make near final drafts of the decision texts. He will assess where he's at. If I was the president, I would convene ministers sometime tomorrow to share the results of the ministerial consultations and identify what a potential package looks like without necessarily putting out a text first. And then take the temperature and see if his judgment of where things are is correct, then put out the text. But I'm not the president, and I'm not a close advisor to the president, as I have been at several other COPs. So I don't have inside information on that. But I think tomorrow we will see some additional movement about where this is all going and the end game, I hope.
Thanks very much, Alden. And in response to Alyssa's question about the global shield, is this even a starter to respond to loss and damage? I think overall, we've had a lot of talk here about a mosaic of solutions needed to address loss and damage, and that is the case. We'll need multiple different types of solutions. There are some gaps within the existing mechanisms, and counting the global shield as one of those existing mechanisms. There's a lot of focus on insurance within the global shield. Insurance is absolutely part of the solution, but doesn't get near to solving the reconstruction cost challenges that countries are facing when massive disasters hit, and not the kind of length of reconstruction funding that's needed as well. So a useful contribution, but not a solution on its own. We will extend for a couple more minutes just to get a line in conclusion from each of our panelists. Nick, can I turn to you first to give us your final line?
Yeah, I think if you told people that we'll be looking at kind of hopefully concluding in COP27 and moving forward into next year with the Ukraine and energy crisis and an economic crisis as strong a few years ago, that have laughed and said, no, climate will drop off the agenda. So, you know, it's a signal that climate is firmly on the geopolitical and geoeconomic table, that it's kind of rolled through this crisis and it's, you know, people are still moving forward, and hopefully we'll come out of COP27 with the basics done. But what we wanted to get done this year on the financial reforms and fiscal space, even more important, and I think, you know, has been really teed up actually by not just by the G20, by Mia Motley and others. So we're really setting for kind of the first half of next year really being critical path for actually showing we can reform the financial system, so that even with the debt and financial crisis and economic crisis we're in, people can afford to finance the transition. So that's you know, it's not all in the COP, but coming out of the COP, we've got a really clear pathway to next year.
Thanks. Alden, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would say we've spent this call talking obviously about the end game here and in the inside COP process, but I would say keep your eye on a lot of the moving objects outside of the COP. We've had those on display here with the Marrakesh Partnership, Global Climate Action set of sectoral days. There's going to be a very powerful closing segment tomorrow of the subnational with the climate champions, the Secretary General, Mary Robinson and others. There's a spirit of radical collaboration amongst governors, mayors, investors, business leaders around the world that contrasts sharply with the game playing, finger pointing, blame casting exercise that we've seen in these negotiations for decades now. This group needs to learn from the subnationals, or the supranationals, as Governor Jay Inslee just called them during the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance event earlier today, and take a page from them. We need to work together. We can't point fingers and say your end of the lifeboat is sinking. There's a lot of bright spots outside of this process, from the Clean Energy Ministerial to the Climate and Clean Air Coalition to some of the deforestation initiatives. We need to bring those into this process, highlight progress, learn from each other's successes and failures, and collaborate as a planet, not argue processes and commas and jots and tittles. We're beyond negotiations. We have to get into radical implementation.
Definitely. And speaking of those things outside the process, Kate, what's your final take on the finance side?
Sure. I mean, I must say the final lines from Nick and Alden have covered these a bit and are a hard act to follow. But I'd just say going into this COP, we always knew that the climate finance negotiation issues were going to be make or break. There's still a great deal of uncertainty about how they will land, but I am cautiously optimistic that we will get sort of some hard-won agreements that will be good enough. And also, it's very clear that the wider financial reform agenda is both playing into this COP and then playing out of it into other forums.
And I would just add that finance is a hardy perennial. You may see the button I'm wearing. It's recycled from Durban in 2011. It says WTF, where's the finance? I gave one to the Egyptian climate champion, Mahmoud Mieldin, yesterday. He put it on his lapel and has been proudly wearing it around the conference. I imagine attracting some attraction and some quizzical stares. But finance is always at the bottom of this, and we have to move forward on the transformational finance outside this process if we're going to get the action we need.
Definitely. And on that note, we'll close here. Quick plug, we will also host a post-COP27 press briefing on Monday. The team will send over the details to everyone for that. And if you would like to get in touch with any of the panelists here or any of our other spokespeople, please email press@e3g.org to share any questions with us. And please get in touch if you're interested in joining that panel on Monday, or for anything else that you'd like to chat with us about. We send out a daily WhatsApp blast. If you're not receiving that already, then please flag that to press@e3g.org and we can add you to the list. With that, so let's sign off. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.